a really good example would be if we're running on the track, I'm quite happy to do a set of 8 400s. It'll give me what I'm after as far as the athletes running at race pace or race speed or goal pace that we know from what are the demands of competition. I find that number of efforts still has the training effect that I'm after, and it has a little less risk.
The Triathlon Show 224. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Coach Jono Hall. Jono is the head coach of Triathlon Canada's National Performance Centre. That means that he coaches some of the top Canadian athletes. For example, probably most notably if you're following the WTS and ITU circuits, Tyler Mislawchuk. And he also has his own squad of international world-class athletes on that short course scene. So in this conversation with Jono, we discuss his coaching philosophy and hear his thoughts on a whole lot of topics related to triathlon performance. This was a live interview that we recorded down in the south of Portugal, in the Algarve, while Jono and Bobby McGee, who you'll hear in next week's episode, were there with the squad of athletes that I just mentioned for a training camp preparing for the first WTS race of the season in Abu Dhabi, and some of the athletes will be racing World Cup races or European Cup races as well. So the final stages of preparation before the competitive season really starts. And it was great to be given the opportunity to watch the squad train and to hang out with Jono and Bobby. So really appreciated that. And of course, super fun to be recording another interview live with one of the top coaches in the industry. Before we get into the interview, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. They help you individualize your hydration and electrolyte intake because everybody loses a different amount of sodium in their sweat. And when sweat rates differ, that means that your sodium replacement requirements may be very different from the person next to you. You can figure out what you should do in your training and racing by getting a free hydration plan on precisionhydration.com, and you can get 15% off your order of electrolytes with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And a big thanks to Roka that you can find on roka.com. One of the most impressive pieces of innovation that Roka has in their arsenal is the arms up technology that they have in all their wetsuits, from entry level to high-end wetsuits, as well as in their tri-suits. So the arms up technology simply means that you will have better shoulder flexibility to make you feel less constricted and constrained when you're swimming in the wetsuit. And the beauty of having the arms up technology in the tri-suits as well as the wetsuit is that if you have Roka tri-suits and wetsuits, you really minimize that restriction that you might otherwise feel, even if you have a Roka wetsuit, because the tri-suit works together with the wetsuit to minimize that. Go to roka.com/TTS to get a 20% discount code off your order of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear from Roka. Now, without any further ado, here's my interview with Jono Hall. So this is a live interview from the Algarve in southern Portugal. I'm here with Jono Hall, who is from Triathlon Canada, and here with his squad of athletes, Canadian and international. So Jono, welcome to the show. Thanks for taking the time. Can you introduce yourself and your role and responsibilities?
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's great to be here. I'm currently employed by Triathlon Canada. I'm head coach, or my title is head coach of the National Performance Centre, but I play a bit of a head coach role across the entire program. I'm an Australian, as you'll tell by my accent, but I have worked now. This is my third full-time position with a different federation. So I started with the Australian Federation, went to USA Triathlon as their performance leader, and then graduated or migrated, whatever you want to say, to Triathlon Canada to play this current role. So I've had a lot of experience travelling, and it's great to be here in the Algarve with the athletes preparing for what is obviously a very important year.
Yeah, definitely. So just to give an idea for the listeners that are following the ITU WTS circuits, who are some of the athletes that you have in your squad?
So the Canadian athletes I have in the squad are basically our Olympic athletes, which is Tyler Mislawchuk, Alexis Lepage, Matthew Sharp, and Desiree Ridnow, who's not here, who's at home studying at the moment. And then due to the nature of my contract with Triathlon Canada, I'm also allowed to coach internationals, which is a two-prong approach to enriching the environment. And it's also to do with the financial nature of my contract. And here in the Algarve, I currently have Kirsten Casper, who races for the US, and I have Kevin McDowell, who also competes for the US. And on top of that, I've just had another young male athlete, Blair Logie, join the squad, who is originally from Scotland, who resides here in the Algarve. And so what I've got is predominantly an Olympic squad, but I've created a mix of athletes who are all following the same goals and all add something to each other. And that's probably something we'll touch on a little bit later, what it takes to be part of that squad.
Yes, definitely. Before we go there, can you give an overview of your coaching philosophy, if you want to call it that, or how you just think about coaching?
That's a good question. I mean, the philosophy, I think, is a key part, and it's probably where I start talking about my coaching to people, because I think it sets people up to have an understanding, whether that be athletes or other coaches or people I'm talking with, and that philosophy is all around getting the highest level of performance with the least amount of work. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. I'm a big subscriber in the nation of efficiency and economy, and so again, maximising what we get. But the main reason is I think there's a relationship between getting the right amount of work and keeping athletes injury free, and there's a huge relationship between athletes being injury free and going on to perform. And then there's this question of longevity as well, is, can I have an impact on athletes across one Olympic cycle? Can I keep those athletes in for 3 or 4 Olympic cycles? And I think that the approach of, like I said, you cannot dispute the level of performance that needs to be attained to race at that level, but you can change and manipulate and gamble a little bit the amount of training and the quantity of training that goes into achieving that. And that's certainly where I fit. So I think it suits people who have a similar mentality, but it also suits athletes who have a very high ability or very high potential, but haven't been able to cope with training given by other coaches. And so I guess if I talk a little bit about, people talk to me about what the perception is of my approach, and that is that it's quite low volume and low duration as a whole. And for some people, I think it works because that's how they respond best. And for other people, it works just because that's the maximum that their individual bodies can take. Yet I think I've demonstrated at times that you can still be effective performer, despite not doing the same amount of training or taking the same approach as some of their peers and competitors.
Yeah, and probably comes back to a bit of FOMO that we talked about with Bobby here. We did that interview just before yours, and perhaps like seeing other competitors in other groups do a lot of volume, then that might make some athletes nervous that shouldn't I be doing the same volume? But at the end of the day, like the performance of the athlete is what determines what is the right volume for that athlete. So what is a typical, it's probably a range with the different athletes that you have, but how much might they be training in a week right now, which is mid to late February, so we're getting close to the season? What is a typical volume?
Yeah, so I measure volume in time, and that can be different to other coaches, but we use time as the primary measure of volume. It kind of oscillates between 18 and up to 22 hours. 22 hours is a big week for my group. And based on, obviously, the thing that really dictates what we can do is achieving the outcomes that we set. And so with someone like Tyler Mislawchuk, who was successful at the test event, for me, it's always some sort of justification of the approach we're taking. And so as a coach, I'm quite anxious as a coach. I take the responsibility very highly, and you obviously have confidence in what you deliver, but you never have that confidence confirmed until the athletes race. And so I'm very confident in my approach, and when the athletes come out and perform at a high level, I guess it gives me further confidence in the approach I take, which then transfers down to the athletes. But I'm very careful not to buy into what other athletes do and what other coaches do, because the reality is I don't spend a lot of time in other people's programs, and everything that I presume to hear is hearsay. And so, I hear, that 30 hours, 35 hours, I have witnessed training volumes much higher than that. And my question is always why? And my main question is, that's great, but can we have the same level of success and get it in an easier way? I think that's the big thing. And I think we were chatting earlier offline a little bit about that, how I express that. And one of the ways I speak with the athletes of this current generation is this notion around the financial piece, and that is, if there's a $10 product, do you pay $15 for it? Do you hand over more than what you really need? Are you happy to pay 10? Or are you not excited about trying to get it for 6 or 8 or whatever? And obviously there's a greedy element to that, and there's an ambitious element to that. But it's really based on the health and well-being of the athletes. But obviously the thing that allows it to happen is performance. If we trained 18 to 20 hours a week and the athletes weren't successful, I wouldn't have a job. And my theory and my method and the philosophy that underpin that wouldn't be valid in any way or form.
Has this philosophy formed mostly from your coaching experience, or did it stem from your athletic career? For listeners that may not know, you were a triathlon world champion, so you have a very decorated athletic career of your own. Did you train this way yourself, or is this pure coaching experience?
I guess my philosophy and my practices are grounded in a huge range of experiences. I'm very careful not to use my own individual experience as an athlete as examples, but they certainly have value. And I think one of the things that has helped me become a good coach is that as an athlete, it wasn't necessarily that I competed, that I had a huge range of different coaching approaches practiced on me. And through that, I guess I formed my own thoughts and philosophies on what could be successful. And, I went from having a road cycling coach with the Australian national team who came from an East German background, who was incredibly high volume. Like I think we did 3 years where I did 44,000 kilometres on the bike a year, which is a lot of volume. I could handle that volume. Whether I was successful off that volume I think I was successful at that volume, but I always had in this mind of could I be as successful with less volume? Because one thing that as a result of that was the cost to me physically, the cost from a time. It was the only thing I had in my life at that time was cycling, because there was literally no room for anything else. And I think you see things like burnout. Then when I went to duathlon and I had some real limitations with what I could do with my run volume, I was almost forced just to take the approach of, I'm going to maximize what I can do. I'm not going to get caught up in how much it is, because at the end of the day, I'm doing everything I can. And it was very low volume. And so you almost had two opposing approaches that, in my experience, I found success, or a way of being successful. And I think pulling those together, and then when I started to coach professionally, I guess I took those approaches, always apply them to the individual athlete. It's not a blanket approach. But I took those approaches and started to apply them to athletes. And it's almost, we're practicing a form of science where we're experimenting, we're observing, we're taking notes, and then we're looking at whether we achieved what we thought we would do. And it's still very much that process. And I'll be honest, if an athlete came to me and said, look, I need 35 hours, I would actually probably tell them, I'm the wrong person. I'm the wrong person to do that. And the person who really interestingly helped me was my wife, Erin Densham, who was a medalist in London. Her approach was quite interesting, because she had a picture in her mind of what she was willing to do to be successful. And she was very clear that she said, I remember saying, if I had to do 30 hours a week to be successful, I wouldn't do the sport, because I think the cost outweighs the benefit. And I remember thinking that, and obviously the nature of our relationship, that we're in a personal relationship and a coaching relationship, it resonated with me, and it made me step back and think that sometimes there are athletes who, as much as they want it, they're still doing this, cost benefit payout all the time. And she was very clear that, if I had to do X amount of training, it wouldn't be worth it. And so over the time, all those experiences put together, working with a variety of people, has helped me form my own philosophy. And I encourage people to always go down that pathway, is to look for other ways of doing it, and investigate them clearly and closely, and how you would apply them. Because as a coach, you're creating these things and these philosophies and these practices, but they're actually practiced on other people. And are they applicable? And are they, do they stand up morally and ethically to, what you're tasked to do? Which is, at the end of the day, as a coach, I've got people engaging me to help them reach their goals, not my goals. And so I've got to be always cognizant of that piece.
Well, that's a really, really good explanation of a lot of things that underpin your coaching. Let's talk about what you view as the fundamentals when it comes to performance in triathlon. What are the fundamental pieces that need to be in place to achieve peak performance?
The fundamentals for me are health and well-being. I think that one of the things that there's a tendency for people to look at is the training, and and how the training's broken down, and all the nuances that are actually real. But when you come back to the foundations and the fundamentals, for an athlete to perform their best, they need to have stability, they need to have homeostasis, they need to have well-being physically and mentally, and that's the area that I prioritise. So at the end of the day, before I go into the detail of writing a training program or a training plan, is my priority is making sure that the athletes are healthy to start off with, and that if we do this plan, we actually have a chance to be successful. Because the likelihood of success isn't guaranteed, and it can be quite low. It's a huge, it's an incredibly competitive world that we work in triathlon. But it's made even harder if the athletes aren't healthy to start off with. And so when I talk about foundations, I talk about that piece: health, well-being, stability, and then there's some other things that follow on as far as ambition, clarity on their goals, clarity on what it is going to take. I think people sometimes enter into things without actually really acknowledging what it's going to take, and they get part way down that pathway and realise that it wasn't what they thought. So I don't sell them a false, bill of goods, so to speak. And then we add the training on top. So the training and that process really comes only when I'm comfortable that the athletes who have engaged me are in a good place to add training on top. And that's just a sense of responsibility that I feel personally. And I think it's interesting because, coaching is a journey in itself. And just recently people like to put a name to everything, and it started to come up that, you're a values coach. And I'm like, well, values coach, it doesn't really matter what the title is, and I'm not into putting things into titles and boxes, but it certainly does underpin the way I approach. And so when you talk about foundations, I talk about health and well-being, and other people might talk about another component of that. But for me, they're the pillars from which then I build the training plan on top of.
And when it comes to the actual training component, where do you stand on the spectrum of using the art of coaching and the science of coaching, or balancing both of them?
I think it's a real balance. I think the art and science of coaching is actually, they're two terms or terms used together that actually depict what exactly goes on every single day. I love the science piece. I've been fortunate to work with some amazing exercise physiologists over time, and I put the science and sports med piece together. So I really love the science and the hard data and the things that are hard to dispute behind it. But with that, I appreciate that alone is only a part of the equation on delivering a training program. And so the art side of it, the soft skills, for want of a better term, I think enable you to deliver the science. So I think one without the other doesn't really work. I think it's fluid. I think that if you were to look at it and say, is it 50-50? I'd say some days it is. I'd say some days it's 99-1. And I think that's part of what you learn and what you start to appreciate as a coach, is that it's not black and white, and that if you can have a scientific mindset because I think that's important. If you have a scientific mindset and then a scientific approach to match that mindset, for me, the next step is to have the right people who can help me, because it's not my area of expertise, and then I can match that with the art piece, the softer skills, the pieces that are about manipulating what we're doing to get the outcome. Then I think you have a successful foundation to have an impact on especially high performance athletes.
Can you give an example of in your coaching, like what is one component, whether it's something that goes into the training program that comes more from perhaps from the science side, and then what is another component that comes more from the art side of things?
Yeah, I think from the science side, the cycling component is the component where I probably use science and data in particular as a really big guiding principle. I think that as I approach, while it's three sports, I still approach them individually at times. And for me, cycling, and you see in the cycling world, it's become very mathematical, it's become very data-driven, and it's become scientific in nature, I believe, to the level that it's quite easy to predict performance. When you have access to everyone's data, and obviously it's easier if you have a world-leading athlete, then you can actually know that you're working from the best case example. Then it's easy to work backwards and say, okay, with that, that's going to help me make decisions. And so the data on the bike really drives the amount of work we do on the bike. It drives the frequency on the bike, and it drives the duration on the bike. And what really drives it is having a deep understanding of what are the demands of competition. And so that just comes with experience and time working in a sport, and having had access to a great number of athletes, but having the privilege to have access to not just a number of athletes, but some of the best athletes, is you start to be able to quite accurately determine what it takes. And it's like anything, once you know what it takes, you can start a process to getting there. And you can start a process where every day you can assess, are we getting there? Are we getting closer? Are we further away? So it holds a coach very accountable, which again is an environment that I thrive in. But it's easy for the athletes to determine, when they say to me, are we getting better? I can show them they're getting better. It's not an opinion. It's something that is clear. The art piece comes in actually is when you have an athlete who's clearly getting better physically, is what happens next? Does that change their performance? Because performance really only happens on the field of play. And that's where I believe the art side comes in. So it's like being given all the right ingredients. If you gave me the ingredients of the same ingredients as a Michelin star chef, I'm not going to make the same recipe. And so the science provides me the ingredients and a measure of the ingredients, the quantities, the dosage, et cetera, but the art of coaching is the piece that pulls all that together with human beings who can make that quite chaotic. And like I said, I kind of keep reiterating that, the aim is to practice something to ultimately perform. And so that's what we're constantly looking for. And I think that mix and the way you go about it, it's certainly my approach. I was going to say it's the right approach, but I'm going to hold back from saying that. I think it's certainly my approach, and I think there's times when that approach has been validated. And I think again, as coaching and working closely with Bobby McGee, we do speak a lot about this validation in coaching, and then building on confidence, et cetera. But that art piece, it's the glue. People use all these cliches and analogies, but it's the glue that holds the science together to actually make it work and be effective.
So if you exemplify that a little bit, so you have the training ingredients sort of from the data and science, and then but to take that to performance, you need the art. What does that look like? Is that instilling confidence in the athlete? Is it race strategy? Is it just keeping them in a good balanced peace of mind day in, day out through the training? What are some of the examples of how to actually take that training and make it into performance?
Actually, that's a really good question, and it makes me think. I think that psychology is the key part in the art of coaching and how it's delivered with the athletes. I think how you create confidence. I'm not into creating motivation, because I think motivation is an innate quality, and I don't think it's the role as a coach to motivate people. But I think creating confidence and belief is a huge part of it. And most of the time, and this is a really general subject, but my experience has been that despite the obvious, athletes find a way to talk themselves down. And so the science and the data that I do gives me a concrete, this is where you are, this is how it stacks up. You could leave the conversation there and go, therefore you should. But the reality is, despite some of that obvious stuff, athletes have doubts, and then working on the psychology part to help them overcome those doubts or get rid of those doubts, knowing that there's a little bit of doubt is healthy because that can be motivating and inspiring, but to overcome those hurdles so that at the end of the day, what I'm looking for on race day is that they are performing at the level they've trained at. And the number of athletes that I see there's something that happens between leaving training and getting to racing where they actually don't even repeat something that they've done 100 times. And so again, it's quite a simple way of looking at it. The tools of doing it are very complex because they're individual, but that kind of approach on the outside with the psychology of getting people confident, and confidence I think is a really big factor, and it's helped by trust. And so if the athletes trust in the process, it generally helps me to talk them into being more confident with some rational thinking and getting out of their rational thinking with the aim that on race day, if they're good enough, they just have to do something they've done 100 times. And so it's not this insurmountable barrier of I have to be better than I've ever been. It's I have to be as good as I was last Thursday in training when there was no pressure or no one watching or, none of the things that potentially take away from that. And so again, that's where I think the art side of it, for want of a better term, really is applicable.
And we already talked about volume quite a bit, so let's touch on the other side of the coin, intensity. How do you incorporate that in your training?
Yeah, intensity forms a big part of my training. But what I do is I'm really careful on the amount, the timing, the frequency, and I probably err on the side of caution. And so an example would be, a really good example would be if we're running on the track, I'm quite happy to do a set of 8 400s. It'll give me what I'm after as far as the athletes running at race pace or race speed or goal pace that we know from what are the demands of competition. I find that number of efforts still has the training effect that I'm after, and it has a little less risk. And I remember the first time doing that, people were very clear that, it was impossible to achieve performance. That's just not enough work. And for me, that was a bit of it's almost like a dare. It's almost like, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. And then through the process, I think we found that coupled with, that's one snapshot of a much bigger program. That coupled with the training that goes around that can be enough. Yet I hear of athletes who habitually run 12 400s or 20 400s, or I've heard of 40 400s. And again, if that's what works for that individual athlete, then so be it. But I think I've just found a mechanism, or I've found athletes who are successful with the mechanism that I employ, which is doing a little bit less. The quality is real quality. And so I think one of the things that I do see, and again, I'm going to generalize here, is that triathletes are in a chronic state of fatigue. And I talk about someone being, they were conditioned to win an inch of their lives. Conditioning doesn't win you races. Speed does. And I had someone else I work with who was very wise. And I remember something he said that stuck in my mind. He said, rest makes you fast, not training. Training makes you tired. And so getting that balance right of the right amount of intensity. And when I do intensity, the most important thing that I look at when intensity isn't the intensity, it's what I'm going to do to recover from the intensity. And so there's got to be a balance, an equal balance, or, compensation for the hard work. But when we go hard, we go really hard. We don't do a lot of training in the middle, grey zones, et cetera, et cetera.
So on a weekly basis, what would a typical week or microcycle perhaps look like? How do you include those days of easier training or time between hard sessions?
Yeah, I guess what I use, I've had people call it a formula, and I think that gives me more credit than is due, because it's not really a formula that is guaranteed. A formula almost talks about something that's guaranteed an outcome, but I use a process where we don't work on calendar days. I've done away with, I was actually conditioned in that as an athlete, where we worked on, cycles of 4 days, cycles of 3 weeks. And so the simple approach I take, rightly or wrongly, is that day one for us is the most intense day. Now, that day could fall on whatever calendar day it falls on is the day it falls on. And it helps having professional athletes because they don't have other restrictions in their lives. But day one is the most intense day. That's the day we look to hit race pace plus, or we look to overextend, even overreach. But that's the day where we really get after it. If we get day one right, day two is what I call tempo day. And I mean, tempo is a funny word because it can be used to describe rhythm, and I use it to describe rhythm and intensity. But when I'm talking to athletes, they understand that tempo is about 85 to 90% of what I would call threshold. If we get that day right, they're pretty fatigued. And on day three, all we can really hope to achieve is volume. Endurance, because that's one thing that's clear is that under fatigue you can still create endurance, but under fatigue it's very hard to improve strength or power or speed. So day three is endurance day. Then day four is a regeneration day of some sorts, and so depending on the work we've done will determine how much rest I give. That can be complete rest, it can be a percentage of rest, which is still quite low. It might be a 24-hour break. So we may finish, for example, at 3 o'clock on day three. We'll train on the next calendar day, being day four, but it's actually a 24 to 36-hour break. So I'm looking more at time, as a measure of when we go again. And then I repeat that cycle. I get to the stage where if we've done enough work, I'll add 2 rest days in that cycle. So it'll be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. And then I tend to stick to 21 day. Sometimes we just did a cycle of 25 days in January, which was an exception, and I was playing around with it, and I think it was successful. I haven't gone into the data enough to really be confident that I would do it again, but we kind of work on these 3 week on, 1 week off. And so it's this whole principle of of overload, progressive overload and recover. But again, for me, the big change that's happened as I've, I guess, grown as a coach, or I've spent more time coaching, is the big change has actually been that I give my athletes more rest than I used to. And I think I had it pushed into me to be afraid of rest, and I see a lot of coaches who are afraid of rest. And sure, if you're not doing the work, then rest is unnecessary. But if you're doing the work, then it's only really, assimilated and absorbed, and you make those adaptations with the help of rest. And so that's the approach that I take, and it's quite simple. And I don't deviate from it very often. The athletes can actually, they don't know the specifics of the session, but they know what's coming. So it also deals with that part where athletes do like to know, like, I might not give them the specifics of the session until the night before or the morning, but they know I need to be ready. I've got 99% sure what kind of work I'm going to be doing so I can get the nutrition right and I can get the psychology right. So I'm setting them up to succeed. But the specifics I like to hold back until I'm really sure that what I wanted to do is still appropriate, because that can change, in 6 to 8 hours or even shorter durations.
So on the specifics, you mentioned the 8x400 example on the run. Do you take a similar approach on the bike and swim, that perhaps less chunky main sets than what we might be used to seeing other coaching or training groups doing in those two disciplines as well, or is it more in running?
No, the approach that I take is across the board. I really try to look at just what is the right amount of work to do. And I think what I've bought into, again, rightly or wrongly, is I've bought into this notion of the crossover between the 3 sports, where, if I'm doing VO2 max work, it's VO2 max work. Your body doesn't necessarily know whether, it doesn't distinguish swimming, cycling, and running. It distinguishes an intensity and a pressure that's applied to the organism that, creates a response. So what I try to do, and I think what helps me achieve less work, is that I try not to duplicate what I'm doing. I try not to double down on everything. And so, endurance is endurance. I think there's a point of saturation with endurance for the athletes I work with, where I do see other coaches who, we've got to swim 1 endurance swim a week, and we've got to do a long run, and we've got to do a long ride. And I'm thinking, at what stage is that cup full? Why does the endurance on the bike not translate to the endurance in the pool? And there's obviously some muscular endurance components become part of it, but when you look at the durations that we're racing the ITU stuff, it's not really that long. And so I just make sure that I get away from this notion of taking these chunky sets which actually duplicate. And I had a coach here this week, a visiting coach who was helping me, and one of the conversations we had was around warm down. And what's always fascinating for me working with individual discipline coaches is that they're very right in their approach, in the sense that we've done some quality work, we've done some lactate tolerance work, we would have generated high amounts of lactate. And I know that because they were rested and they had the right nutrition to achieve that, because I think that's one of the other things is the sets you do, can you actually achieve them when you're fatigued? But nonetheless, we did this set, and then he started to prescribe what was quite a long warm down. And I said, why are we warming down? He said, well, we need to warm down. I said, yeah, but the guys have got another session. Like, this isn't in isolation. And I always use the analogy, if we warmed up and warmed down for each individual session in triathlon like we did for individual disciplines, we'll be training 10 hours a day, because that process is quite long. So I'll be honest, I'm hazarding a guess here that there is this crossover, this enormous crossover, that allows me to approach triathlon like I do an individual discipline sport. So where I've tried this is I was coaching Simon Clark in professional cycling, and I was saying, okay, these are guys who race 3 weeks in a row. These are guys that are racing events like Milan-San Remo, which is over 7 hours. They're not doing much more than 23, 24 hours volume. Why would I do 30 to 35 hours volume? So when I do the programming, it's done in volume by duration, and then I just divide the pie up based on what we need and what that individual athlete needs and what the race we're preparing for. So I find it hard to explain, and it's hard, I think, at times. I know I've struggled with other coaches to create that picture in their mind, but it's ironic because in my mind it's kind of really, really clear. So I think that's one of the challenges, and obviously, as you're finding, I'm pretty wordy as well.
Well, it's definitely a very interesting theory of the mechanism behind it. But I mean, this is how things work. Like, in coaching precedes finding the mechanisms for anything. So like anecdotal evidence, like you have found a recipe that works for you, and then you have this theory for the crossover effect that might be the reason for it. And to me, it sounds pretty logical, to be honest. I don't consider it like a bad explanation at all, but who knows? Maybe something else is behind it as well. Either way, it's really, really interesting to hear how you approach things. But just one on this topic, then, when you have the intensity on day one of the cycle, you still do intensity in all three disciplines then, and similarly on day two when you have tempo, or would you maybe do 2 out of 3, or how does that work?
Now, that's a good question. I guess I don't approach them as disciplines. I have a very clear picture of the type of intensity I want to do, the duration of that intensity, and then I look for the modality, being swim, bike and run, that's best going to achieve that, and is going to have the least amount of impact or risk from this injury or this well-being, I guess, foundation that I spoke about earlier. And so we chunk our sessions, or what I refer as chunking. We tend to train in the morning, and then I separate my training. If it's easier training, I try to create a minimum period of 4 hours. If it's intense training, then I try to create a minimum period of 6 hours between sessions. Now, those 2 periods, they could be swim, bike and run in the morning, and theoretically they could be swim, bike and run in the afternoon. It doesn't ever work out that way, but what I'm looking for is X amount of time divided, split up into the disciplines that I'm working on, and then X amount of time in the afternoon divided as I need to based on the individual, strengths and weaknesses of the athletes, the races we're preparing for. So very rarely will I do intensity across all 3 disciplines. And I'm looking for, like I said, what I can achieve realistically, knowing that if I get and I'm talking real intensity, if we get the real intensity right, you've only really got one shot at it. And so it's important to get it right. And then it's important to let that work settle. And I think that's, overcome the risk of being greedy and going, well, that was great. I wonder if we could do a bit more this afternoon and where that will lead. And my experience is the gains are minimal and the risks outweigh the gains. And so, again, when you look at that if you were to look at what I'm doing graphically, you would see these bars based on that 4-day cycle, and then within that on a daily basis, you would see these 2 chunks of time. where they are blocked out. We're going to train in these time, and that's what the athletes get. You need to be available in these times, and as we get closer, they'll be told what disciplines we're going to do, and as we get closer, there'll be the actual breakdown of the session. And so again, it's a balance because the athletes always like to know earlier, but as I tell them, like, if you want to be the best, sometimes you have to have the inconvenience of getting information a little bit later, never too late, because that's not effective. And so I work on this game of patience, knowing that when you need the information, you'll have it. And if I don't give you information, it's because I'm questioning what I wanted to do. And I think that's one of the other things no one critiques me harder than me. And I'm always questioning whether what I'm doing is right, and I'm always looking for someone, not necessarily to validate what I'm doing, but I'm looking for someone to point out that what I'm doing is wrong. And so again, it's an experiment that's going on all the time.
So can you explain that a bit more? Like, for example, tonight after we finish this interview, I guess you might be going back and reviewing what you did today with some hard bike riding and some swimming in the afternoon. What does that process look like for you? And in what scenario might you change what you had planned for tomorrow?
That's another really good question. So the process for me at the end of the day, well, it generally happens within 15 minutes of the session. So one of the things in the group that I have the privilege to coach is that we have these agreements, and the agreement is that for me, and it's a bit like tennis. And so the agreement means that for me to best help them, they need to give me feedback immediately. Now, the data side's really easy because most of the devices they're using that measure what went on during the session either upload automatically as close as they get to their computer, or they can upload it quite quickly. But the big thing for me is the context, are the comments. I use Training Peaks as a tool at the moment. We're looking at making some changes as far as, is there something better or something easier? And that follows with that notion for me. Everything's about, can we make it easier? Can we make it, a little bit more time efficient? But then I assess what we're doing. And the first thing I assess for is, did we achieve what I wanted to achieve? And even in the micro session in the day, what we're doing in the morning, if I don't think what we did in the morning is going to allow me to achieve what I want to achieve in the afternoon, then I'll change it. And I say to the athletes, it's my prerogative at any time to change the training we're doing. But if I make a decision, it's based on some facts, based on a combination of some objective measures and some subjective measures. And so like tonight, we finished the swim first, and some had a run after the swim. I've gone in, I've reviewed all the data. So I've looked at the duration, I've looked at the intensity that I was looking for. Did they actually follow the prescription? I've looked at the comments to how they feel. And for tomorrow, for example, I've actually taken out one session. I plan to do what I'd put down in my mind as a recovery swim. And I've looked at it, and I've actually made a decision. I thought it's going to be 30, 35 minutes of not really anything. Like, it's not going to give me what I thought I might need. I think their training balance right now is very good. We're going to do a recovery ride, and it's very explicit what that looks like from an intensity perspective. But I've taken out a swim already. Now, if tomorrow morning they go and do the recovery ride and they get home, like I said, within 15 minutes, the agreement is I've got the data and the comments. If I feel that someone isn't recovered, then I may add the swim back in. I may pick up the phone and go, listen, you haven't finished you're not where I thought you were going to be. And to get you to where I need you to be tomorrow, we're going to do something. And that inversely, that can be, I'm going to remove a session. And there's a lot of work goes into getting athletes comfortable with that, because athletes tend to think that a remove session is a punishment. And I say a remove session is a reward. And so there's a lot that goes on. There's a lot that's gone on behind the scenes that's allowed me to work with this group of individuals, for them to have the trust in me as a coach that what I'm doing is I'm constantly assessing, and I'm probably assessing myself. I'm assessing myself as a coach as much at the same time as assessing them as the athletes. But that, again, that's the process. So I sat in the corner, 30 minutes ago and went through Training Peaks. And what I'm looking for is something that is an outlier, something that grabs my attention. So it's a high level. Is there anything there that I didn't think I'd see? It's okay. Then I give them that confirmation. Tomorrow we're going to start at 9:30. We're going to start on a bike. Then I went in a little bit deeper and said, okay, I've given them the green light, but can I go in a bit deeper and look for something that I didn't expect to see? Once I've seen what I expected, then it's the green light and it's go ahead. But that happens That can happen 3 times a day. It certainly happens every day. And I think it's that process and that attention to detail really, I think it should underpin what all coaches do. And I think it does when you look back and you try to distinguish, why some coaches have successful programs, why some don't. I think what you will find is some common denominators around this attention to detail and this willingness to constantly assess and be prepared to be wrong. And I think that's the other thing, is putting your hand up and say, "Some guys, I got today wrong. I thought it would lead to this, and you're in this stage. I can make it better or worse. I can be stubborn and stick to my plan, or I can be honest and go, we need to change the plan." And again, that's based on a foundation of a very high level of trust and confidence in what I'm doing, which obviously is something that is garnished over time. But new athletes come in and that's the first thing I ask them. I go, "I just need you to trust me and give me a period of time. And I need you to follow what I say pretty much to the letter until there's a reason not to. And if there's a reason not to, then obviously we have something to talk about."
And when you look for whether you achieved what you wanted to achieve, I mean, one of the things that you said you look at is was the prescription followed? So that leads into, how do you prescribe sessions? And do you have a preference for prescribing using RPE, heart rate, pace, power, etc.?
So how I prescribe the actual sessions and workouts will depend on the modality. Swimming's done to pace. And the pace is really dictated on some fundamental testing, not the level of testing I would like to do, but some very basic testing, and then in conjunction with demands of competition. I think there's one thing I do have. I have this understanding, which has come through time, obviously, of what it takes. So swimming's based on pace as the main goal. Cycling is all power in conjunction with their subjective feedback. But it's also power, but looking at the torque piece of that. So not just, so looking at the force component of power, not just the acceleration, and distinguishing where people are at. Are these people, can they meet the demands of competition because they deliver it through cadence? Are they meeting it because they can deliver it through force? And always take into account that, in my opinion and my experience, that running off the bike, there's a high relation to the force relation in the power equation as opposed just to the power equation.
Can you elaborate on that?
When you look at the top runners and you look at their build, so like Tyler, I'll use an example because I don't think there's no shame in using an example. Like Tyler Mislawchuk, we keep him around 59 to 60 kilos, which is a battle. And so he's not a big, strong boy. He doesn't have the muscle mass. Now, the advantage of that, if he was just a runner, is that he has the exact attributes that you would look at and you would categorize as being necessary to be a world-class runner. But he's not a world-class runner, he's a triathlete. So he needs to be able to get through that bike section. If he was someone who rode low cadence and tried to use force as the primary driver in achieving power, we would have to do one of two things. We would have to either increase his muscle mass, which would potentially decrease his running, or we would do it without increasing muscle mass, which would create a huge amount of fatigue. And so that's where I really dial into the details on how we're going about things. And I think that, the best athletes master everything. They can produce the force if they choose to, but they know when to. They can produce the cadence. Kirsten Kasper's a good example, and she's still at work in progress, which is really exciting because she's been successful. But most of her power is achieved through cadence. She's found an ability to comfortably sit at 120 to 125 RPM. It obviously has a limit. There'll be times in certain courses where you need that brute force. And that, for me, is the exciting part about her as an example, is that's something we're yet to achieve. But if you gave me two athletes and said which one I would prefer the low torque, high cadence approach in its effect on running off the bike than the low cadence, high force impact, because I would say that athlete probably, their shape, their lower limb muscle mass I would presume to be a lot higher, because there's one thing that's very clear, is there is that relationship between the ability to produce high force and muscle mass. And so, but it's almost counterintuitive to what you would do with a runner. So for me, this is where the interesting stuff happens, because no one can tell you that they've got it all dialed in. It is all trial and error and based on a lot of anecdotal and some scientific background on achieving, but pulling it all together is what makes triathlon coaching so exciting.
Yeah. So prescriptions, let's keep going with that. We were at cycling power.
Cycling power. Running, I'm just starting. I'll be honest. I've been a slow adapter with power. I'm not convinced yet, and a little of that is probably a little bit of arrogance. And I say, well, I think the guys are running quite well, so why would I do anything different? But I'm not naive enough, I think, to buy into that. So I'm starting to incorporate that. I still use heart rate, which I know is old school, but I use heart rate more of a guide. So one of the things I do take control over, and one of the things I've done that you would say applies to all athletes is I've slowed down their longer, slower running. So I've got them to run slow, and I don't like the word polarized, but we have pulled apart. When they run slow, they run very slow, and when we run fast, we run very fast. And I use heart rate as a measure because I've got to use something to slow them down, where I'll say we're doing a long run. Pace isn't as reliable with GPS, but I'll say, I'll set a heart rate ceiling. And I know it's not exact, and I know the scientific people out there will probably cringe a little bit, but at the end of the day, you have a toolbox and you have a variety of things, and you're looking for an outcome, and you tend to grab the one that delivers the outcome. And so for me, that's been the catalyst. And after a period of time, you actually can take away some of the tools because the athletes buy in and they go, no, I get it. I can self-pace now, whereas the new athletes struggle too. So that's how I approach the three disciplines. I use pace on running. We use a lot of goal pace. And we're working on it at the moment. We're speculating, but we're saying, I'm working on the presumption that, to be a gold medalist in Tokyo and you're only looking at the run, you've probably got to run between 29:15 and 29:30 in what will be extreme environmental conditions. So from that, and no one can guarantee that, and so there's the risk involved, but from that I can work backwards and say, well, what workouts do I need to do to achieve that level of performance on that date? And then I create a trajectory to get there. So you've got to anchor off something, and normally you're looking to anchor off something that's concrete, that's a guarantee. When someone says, absolutely, if you know in swimming more or less within a second, if you swim this time, you will be successful. In triathlon, it's a little bit more subjective due to the nature of the sport, with the swim and the bike first, and then the environmental conditions. But you still have to anchor on something, and I think that's what I've learned is I've developed a degree of confidence where I can anchor, predict, and then that helps guide the process to what I'm doing from prescription. In that case, with running, it can be pace. We need to achieve that outcome, we need to do X amount of work at a certain amount of pace for a certain duration, and that's done progressively.
Have you taken the same approach to easier, low-intensity training in biking and swimming as well, or is it mostly running?
No, I've applied that across the board. I've tried to create. I've got a philosophy on what I'm looking for in intensity, and at the end of the day, the tools, the mechanism we do that, it's just to try and reinforce that, or to give the athletes a guide or a measure, because obviously I can't put myself in their bodies. I can see what they're doing, but I certainly can't feel what they feel. So I think at the end of the day, you've got to come up with something that has the athletes achieving what you want them to do. And so, no, definitely, we do. I think you'll hear the athletes say, and I've had challenges with athletes who refuse to train slow, and they've been conditioned in a certain way or with other coaches, and really see those relationships don't last long, because what it does do, and where it manifests isn't in their slow, medium training. It manifests when their inability to hit the high end stuff, and they get frustrated, but I think they form a key role in creating that, because of the level of fatigue. They're running faster than they need to, or riding faster than they need to when they should be going easy. But managing that and controlling that is quite a challenge.
So what are the specific ceilings? Like if you talk about heart rate or power-based prescriptions for those low-intensity runs and rides and swims, what would the prescription be?
Look, the prescriptions are very individual, but I probably use 60% of heart rate max as a bit of a ceiling. And then, and so that would be an athlete I haven't worked with, or I haven't got a lot of data on. I'll start conservatively. And obviously, as you go through time, it narrows and it becomes more precise as you work it out. But I am conservative, because the only concern I have with running slow, I have this thing, you can't run too slow, but obviously you can mechanically. And I think, Bobby McGee and I go back and forth on this quite a lot, is that if you can run slow from a velocity perspective, but you can take control of the run cadence, the stride rate, and maintain it high, then is there a too slow? And you see, people refer to, the African shuffle, and look at the way they warm up and you think, well, how can someone who runs so fast warm up so slow? But if you look at it, it's not slow, lazy running. It's slow in velocity, but it's very deliberate in the way they go about it, their arm carriage, their foot strike, the frequency of foot strike. So they're the big things that I do. So when I look at that, I'm not afraid to slow it right down. And then again, I take that same approach, like better to be too slow than too fast. Like very rarely do you come home and go, wow, I got injured today because I ran too slow. And so again, it's a conservative approach. And you'll probably find that in reality, I'm quite risk averse. But in that, like I said, when you go right back to our first conversation, that risk averse conservative nature, if one of my foundations is health and well-being, it certainly ties a lot of that stuff in together.
Yeah, that's a perfect explanation. And what about periodization? How do you, if you periodize things, or is it fairly similar from year to year or across the year?
For me, the periodization works back from the race calendar, and I certainly wouldn't say it's traditional. I'm a big, fan or advocate for setting athletes to succeed. And when you look at the way the ITU calendar's laid out in particular, it's quite difficult to apply the perfect periodization to it without sacrificing something. I mean, one of the greatest challenges, it's hard, and I'm probably against it, but at the end of the day, I kind of try to rise up to the challenges in our Olympic sport. You spend 4 years preparing athletes to be world champion, which is about consistency over 5 to 6 races. And in every 4 years, the big dance, the Olympics, is about performance on one day. So you've got these opposing process. And so what I try to do is I try to lay out what I would still call it a periodization, because it's broken down into periods with clear goals. And when you look at it retrospectively, it certainly has clear rhythms and it becomes obvious. Doing it forward is a bit harder, but I would say I certainly periodize what I do. I'm a fan of what people call block training, so getting chunks or blocks of specific work done within that periodization. But periodization really comes back from the races we're trying to do, and the only time it's a luxury to go into, I think it's a luxury to go into races and train. I'm going to train through this race. And I think, well, why are we racing? What are we going to get from a race we train through? It's arrogant to think you'll win. The data we get and what we learn is skewed by fatigue. Why don't we just do it properly or not do it? And so again, it gets easier. And one thing that's very clear, and it's the privilege I have, is that I'm talking from a position of privilege because I have world-class athletes who I coach. And because of that, I can sit down with a Tyler Mislawchuk and I know what races he's doing through the year. So it makes my attempt at periodization easier. But there's athletes who are new who it's very hard to even attempt to periodize because they've got to score points and there's no guarantees. And I see coaches, one of the things I see coaches make a mistake, they pick a race. We're going to peak for Montreal WTS. And I think, that's not a race you're actually guaranteed to even start. There's got to be some things that give you the privilege to peak for a certain race. You've got to have some guarantees. And I think that's it's the reality of what we do. And I remember doing a presentation on this in Australia, and one of the things I got was, did I periodize this plan for this under 23 athlete? And I said, well, no, not in the traditional form, because we were clear we wanted to race world champs. That was our goal race. But the process to get there meant he needed to perform at certain races to be selected, which meant certain levels of performance. And when you laid out the timing of those, it actually went against all the general principles of what you would do if you had a choice. If you had a choice, you'd be like, August 26th, Olympic Games, that's my goal. If I don't have any athletes who are selected for the Olympics, so even with Tyler, we have a goal for that date. One of the ironies is he's not actually guaranteed. Now, the question everyone says, well, who else is Canada going to take? And I say, well, yeah, but the reality is we're almost flying in the face of the fact he's not selected. He's not guaranteed. He's not on that team, yet we're preparing for that. And you get yourself into that position where you have the luxury of doing that, and it's easier. but it's quite rare you have that luxury. And that's where it's interesting working across different federations. Someone like a Nicola Spirig going into London, she probably knew she was going to the Olympics 4 years out, without being guaranteed. Like it's an obvious thing. Whereas you look at the Australian girls, they're fighting each other until end of May. And so you go, well, how do you go through that process and you can't not peak to make the team because the team's so competitive. But if you peak to make the team, okay, you make the team, how competitive are you going to be at the Olympics? And so certain athletes and certain federations have, I guess, an advantage. And you would think that those coaches who work with those types of athletes probably should be exercising some sort of, classical periodization or something that's been more scientifically proven. Whereas the reality is most athletes and coaches are dealing with a much more chaotic approach. So I know, again, another long answer, but, I certainly, if I was going to argue, do I periodize? Absolutely. Is it traditional or standard? Would you recognize it? Maybe not. But that's the nature of the sport we deal in.
I guess it's perhaps getting into semantics a bit, but it sounds like there's not a specific formula, but there is variation, there is change throughout the year.
Yeah, I think, we always run the risk, I think, in these conversations getting into semantics, but there's periods of training that we do that are very deliberate and very set up around the outcomes we're trying to achieve. It's just, like I said, it's not something if you were sitting with someone they would recognise straight away as being what people would term periodization.
So when you talk about the intense workouts and how an equally important thing to the workouts is the recovery from those workouts, talk about that recovery, but also nutrition and nutrition generally speaking. How do you view that for these elite triathletes?
I think nutrition is critical. I think I always knew that it was critical, but I didn't put the value on it as a young coach that I think I needed to. And that's probably because we got away with certain things. So for me, the gains in nutrition aren't always obvious, but they're apparent when you're looking at performance and you start to review performance. What's the difference between this performance and that performance? And you start dialing into it and you're like, no, that's the same. And one of the things I found is, the thing we changed was the quality or the nutrition, the approach to nutrition. Especially, my focus has been and my belief has been that to win the sport, you need to be a fantastic runner. And I know I'm stating the obvious there. And with that comes a certain body type, body shape. But with that, on the flip side, comes some risks with nutrition. So there's this push towards, very light, lean bodies, small muscle mass. And the ways of achieving that can be through, I guess, what I would call cheating in nutrition. Yet, the strength part of triathlon is critical and you need nutrition to underpin that strength part. So nutrition is an area that I've gone deeper and deeper into to the point where I outsource what I do because I think it's such a specific area and it's such an area that's constantly undergoing research and constantly being updated, some of it good, some of it bad, but, every athlete I work with has access to a nutritionist, a dietitian, that is, I guess, integrated in what I'm doing training-wise. So again, if you talk about periodization, for me, that's about, we match our nutritional needs based on the training. And so there's a tight relationship between myself and the people who work with me in nutrition to make sure that the athletes are fueling to meet the demands I'm setting. And so that is a huge piece. And it's a piece that I'm excited about because I think I'm probably only really 50% of the way through getting it right. And so there's 50% more potential to enhance performing, which is exciting for me because we're not talking about enhancing performance, doing more work. Nutrition for me is the free stuff. It's the stuff that we can take care of that takes a bit of organisation and it takes a little bit of discipline, but it's not more hours out swimming, riding or running. And I think I think we're seeing that in some other sports. I think there's a whole debate around the impact of obviously running shoes, but I know intimately there's some coaches who are having a huge impact on the nutritional approach to marathon runners. And so I'm going, yes, the shoes are making these guys faster, but I also know that in the background their attention to nutrition is higher than it's ever been, and that's in a traditional sport. And I've seen that in having the luxury of working in cycling as well. when I look at what are the new frontiers, it's ironic that some of these new frontiers are what I call foundations. There's been an acceptance or an embracing of how nutrition can enhance performance through the aid of recovery, but also energy availability then to achieve maximal levels of performance.
And recovery, what is there to say about recovery that we haven't said already?
No, I mean, I think recovery is two parts. There's a mental part and there's a physical part. And I think that all recovery does is it speeds up the process. It never eradicates fatigue entirely, but it's about maximising your chances of recovering from a session so you can do the next session. And there's a physical and psychological component to that. And I think with me, I give the athletes a range of modalities they can use to recover, and that are all, supposedly demonstrate to be effective. But the big thing, recovery, is also the psychological part. Is, are they rested psychologically, and do they believe their recovery is working? And so, if I say to someone, you're going to use contrast baths, you're going to use hot and cold, and they don't believe in it, doesn't really matter how scientifically proved it is. There's a huge component in their belief. So I use a range of modalities. I'm big on soft tissue therapy. Again, it's probably the least of the physical therapies that has any real scientific backing, but my background creates a bias, and then by practicing it and seeing the results I've had, not the performance results, but one of my measures of success is number of days lost to injury and illness. And we lose, by design, the minimum number of days to injury and illness. And I've bought into the fact that my use of soft tissue therapy at the right time, and I'm just talking massage, correlates, or it's not correlate, is indicative of that. It's one of those probably things where, I don't mind pulling some things out now and then and go, well, does it really impact? But soft tissue therapy is one I'm actually quite personally attached to. And so it doesn't come at a huge cost. I certainly don't think it does any harm to athletes. The athletes believe in it, so it could be a little bit of a placebo. But then, again, it's the athlete's personal preference. If they feel recovered, after a hard session or in between sessions or the day after a race, then that's probably indicative they're going to be able to achieve the targets in training. And so again, it comes down to that debate. What is recovery? How do you measure recovery? For me, recovery is the ability to come out and do the next session that you required at the level you wanted. And you go, yep, recovered, ready to go. And there's a variety of ways, obviously, to achieve that.
A few final questions. So first, I wanted to ask, do you see anything out there that you think is overhyped or reaching fad-like status?
Look, I think in this day and age, everything's overhyped, because I think everything has a place, and there is no one piece that provides the silver bullet. Everyone's looking for a silver bullet. So anything that's, I guess, presented or marketed as being, this is the one, if you have one thing that needs to be this one, I kind of roll my eyes at. Obviously, I'm a coaching advocate. So when people say, I've got X amount of dollars, what should I get? Coaching. What tools do I use? Well, it depends. There's no one tool that's going to make it better. It's the culmination, the pulling together everything that's available. So there's nothing for me that stands out as being overhyped. In actual fact, I think everything's a little bit overhyped, and I respect that, everyone's trying to pitch that what they have makes the difference. That's general marketing. But for me, I'm yet to find something, a device or a tool or something like that actually has changed our lives, has changed the direction of what we do outside of things like an iPhone or, things that are around communication.
And what do you think are the most common mistakes that athletes, whether it be amateur or professional, do in their triathlon training?
I think the most common mistake is this notion of overtraining or doubling down. So there's an inherent insecurity, which leads people to go, well, I'll just do a bit more and that will surely make it a bit better. And whereas I guess I'm an advocate for maybe try a little bit less and see if that makes you better. And so it's a generalist statement, but when I look at people, the majority of people are either dupe unbeknownst to them, are duplicating, or they're doing more of something than I think they really need that will set them up to meet their goals or their demands.
And what would be your final piece or pieces of advice for age group triathletes specifically?
I think health and wellness. I think that I spoke about it earlier with my elite Olympic level athletes, and if they're, that's the highest level of performance that I think you can attain in our sport. And so I think if you've got athletes at that level who are talking about something as fundamental as health and well-being, then it should be applied across the board. And so I always encourage any and all athletes, get your health right, get some stability, create some form of homeostasis, and then add training on top of that, and prioritize that as that foundation, that piece that will then set you up to succeed. How well you'll go will ultimately depend on, again, what training you do and what you're able to do with your time and your life. But I'm quite clear that an unhealthy athlete is guaranteed to fall short of the goals that they're looking for. And I've always said, I'd rather race undertrained than injured. You can always toe the start line with a few less hours training. It's very hard to toe the start line injured, whether that injury be physical or mental.
And to wrap up the rapid fire questions with one sentence answers only, so a bit of a challenge, but let's see how you get through them. The first one being, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to endurance sports?
I'm reading something at the moment, which I think, and I'm going to get this wrong, is called 33 Approaches to War, and it's just to do with strategy. And so I read a lot of stuff on strategy. I'm big on techno music. I'm not a triathlon person. I don't listen to anything or read anything related to triathlon. I try to do my job during the day and switch off from triathlon, because I think that, again, noting that there's a point of saturation. What I do is I make sure that the knowledge that I don't have or I'm not willing to get, I surround myself with people who have it.
That could be the answer to the second question, perhaps, which is, what's the personal habit that's helped you achieve success? But if you want to say that or something else, add something, then feel free.
More than personal habit, I think I work on a habit to try and create a balance, and to help me achieve my success, I've surrounded myself with people who are much smarter than I am. And all I really do is I play a role as the conductor. I bring those people into triathlon, which is a balance, and a lot of them make me look a little bit better than I am.
Yeah, there's this famous saying, I don't know who it's attributed to, but if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Which
I've never been in that room.
Yeah. Finally, what do you wish you had known or done differently at some point in your career?
Two things. I wish I'd known or appreciated or embraced the notion of rest earlier in my triathlon career. I think I could have done a better job as a coach early on. And I wish someone had told me how competitive coaching is and how tough it can be working in a really, really competitive environment, an environment that with social media can get quite nasty. And so, yeah, I wish I'd had it wouldn't have changed what I'd done, but it probably would have prepared me for where I'm at.
All right. Thank you so much, Jono. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you and hear your thoughts on training and performance. Again, thank you for having me here and Watch Your Athletes Train, and for being on the podcast and sharing with the listeners.
Absolute pleasure. And I know that everyone loves what you're doing and your contribution. And it's a pleasure to have you here.
All right. I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. I want to, again, just thank Jono and Bobby so much for taking the time to do these interviews, to take their evening to sit down in front of the microphone and chat, but also to, of course, allow me to be present for the sessions that they delivered to the squad and just hang out and talk coaching, which I really, really appreciated massively. I'll just mention really quickly that perhaps the biggest takeaway of all from this very interesting conversation for me was about the crossover effect that Jono talked about between the three different disciplines, and how that crossover effect impacts how to think about both volume and intensity of training, and what really is the minimal effective dose. that was for me something that I keep thinking about even now, a week or so later. If you want to revisit this episode in written form, as usual, you can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com, where we'll also have links to related episodes. We'll have links to all episodes that have the elite coach tag, and specifically a couple of interviews that I think would be useful to listen to and compare and contrast to this one are the ones that I did with Adil Tveiten in just last week's episodes, actually, which is almost the polar opposite of the philosophy of Jono. That just goes to show that there are many ways to skin a cat. So if you haven't listened to that, make sure to go and do that as well. But also the one with Philip Sipe from a few weeks ago, which is very similar, I think. And Philip's philosophy is very aligned with Jono's. So that was another example of these things that we talked about in today's interview. And next week, I interview Bobby McGee. This was from the same weekend of being in the Algarve for the training camp, where Bobby McGee was also helping out with Jono's squad. And we sat down for an evening with doing first one interview and then the next. And next week, you'll hear the one with Bobby, who, if you don't know it, is one of the world's most renowned running coaches and triathlon running coaches specifically. One piece of house cleaning items before we wrap up for today. I have just launched the newly updated website. So scientifictriathlon.com has a new look and feel to it. You can find all of the same information as before, but hopefully things should be a lot clearer, better presented, and so on. There will still be some bugs, some typos, and some things going on. So bear with that, and we'll hopefully be able to clean those out as time goes by. But already I think that it is much, much, much better than it was previously. So hopefully you'll find it too. Check it out if you're interested in learning about, for example, our training plans and our coaching services. Big thanks to Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Get 15% off your electrolytes with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka that you can find on roka.com/TTS. That's where you can get a 20% discount code for your order of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.